Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram itam Shri Radhika-prananatha pāda sarojayo yena premanubhutyasya dattam tam Shri Gurum bhaje Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vilashojitam Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shajvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payora Shomudake Lato Bande Bhagavatani Mananudavam Murdnani Patyakshito Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripa Krite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupa Bhut Tanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Surato Pangol Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Adadana-strinam dantoir yacheham puna puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhulisyam Janma Janmani Abhirapali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Bilashati Balashvavara Sri Rupa Chinta Malasapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdanta Haichurastam Raganugami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasada Smaratam Brajendhum Shri Rupa Pada Kamala Shrita Chetasame Chittam Satam Madhukari Yatu Pada Padme Bhaktir Yanikilarta Varga Jananiya Brahma Sakshat Krite Anandatishaya Prada Vishaya Jat Sukyat Vimuktirya Shri Radha Ramanam Padam Bhajayugam Yasya Mahanashrayo Saji Yad Hari Yakarya Vrajaloka Gurutara Premnaiva Tasyai Namah Yaram Yanikilagha Shanga Shamani Shrodra Tritim Sangata Yasvadya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Yadhyata Hridaye Vrajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yad Hari Bhakta Vrinda Mahita Dhanyeha Padyavali. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Mahasagar, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the Kris Jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnavacharyas, the fulfiller of his heart's desire on this earth, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again today we'll continue our discussion of Padyavali, and we resume in the Bhagavad-dharma-tattva prakaranam, the section on the essential nature of Bhagavad-dharma. So in the course of discussing verse 114, we're discussing the first topic in the verse, that of how the deity of Sri Bhagavan is to be seen. And now we're looking at statements on this subject given in the Bhagavad-dharma-tattva to understand the importance of and the benefit of worshipping the deity. And in the course of this passage in the Bhagavad-dharma-tattva, there's a mention of verses in the Bhagavatam that appear to belittle the practice or speak of it as being for those of lesser stature. So in the commentary there, some examples are given. So now we're looking at those example verses, and we're looking at the commentary given on those verses by Jiva Gosvami Pāda or Vishnu Chakravarti Pāda or Sridhar Swami Pāda as appropriate or as relevant to understand what is the way that these verses are best understood. So we've discussed last time verses 329 to 29, chapter 29, third canto, verses 21 to 24 in this passage, and so at the verse 25 we'll also discuss the commentaries on that today, which summarize the whole gist of what is taught in that section by Kapila-dev. So, continuing from where I left off in the last file, and if we go further enough, then we'll continue on to a new fresh file. So they're both in the folder. So I'm proceeding now. Finally, in regard to 329.25, Sri Jiva summarizes the primary import of this whole set of verses and clarifies the nature and cause of the attitude referred to by the verse under discussion, quote, one who in regard to a deity of Viṣṇu has the thought of a stone, arcye viṣṇau śilā dhīr. So again, all this talk is to help us understand what's the point made in this verse we're talking about, and here in this commentary on this verse, Jiva Goswami also makes reference to that verse, from which we can get an understanding about its intended meaning. So, again, as usual, because this is extended discussion, I'm just reading translations I've given of the statements of Jiva Goswami or other commentators, and we can discuss the Mool text as per anyone's interest. So, thus in this way, on the part of one devoid of Shraddha in Bhakti, as a result of an absence of knowledge of Ishvara, a fault has been stated in the preceding verses. That is, one who worships that should be a deity of Ishvara, but disrespects his presence in all living beings by showing disrespect to those living beings, is said to be at fault in the sense that their worship does not bear fruit with any sort of swiftness. They do not have any peace of mind, and Bhagavan does not become pleased with them. So these are summarizing the points made in the earlier verse. So he says, then, teaching specifically worship of him combined with swadharma, and in this context, swadharma means teaching the twofold practice of engaging in ritual worship of a deity of Ishvara and observing the duties of one's varna and ashram, to be the cause of knowledge of him, which in turn is the cause of shraddha in him. Kapila-dev accepts the non-futility even of such worship, that is, even of the worship performed in ignorance, mentioned in the preceding verses, that was compared to merely making oblations into ashes. Archa do, meaning he speaks this verse. So, something very significant in this statement of Jiva Goswami is tangential to our theme of discussion, but nevertheless is worth noting, which is that Jiva Goswami here twice refers to knowledge as the cause of Shraddha. And I'll just pull up the exact statement here. By saying, tad Shraddha hetu tad jnana, or jnanasya. And then again he repeats this, saying, where is it? Ishvara gyan abhavat bhakto ashraddhanasya. So what's notable here is that he's speaking of Shraddha, as of knowledge of Bhagavan as the cause of Shraddha in him. So this theme that the Kanishta Bhagavata has recognition of the presence of Bhagavan in the deity, but not in bhaktas, not in others. What is that? That's a lack of knowledge. That's a lack of understanding of Bhagavan's presence in those other places. And in a deeper sense, it's a lack of a richness of heart or a breadth of heart to embrace and honor that presence of Bhagavan in others. But fundamentally, it's an absence of knowledge. So, why would one lack conviction in Bhagavan being present in bhaktas and others? Because one doesn't know that he's there. In other words, because one lacks knowledge in that. So, thus, the cause of having Shraddha in the presence of Bhagavan in those places is a knowledge of his presence there. So this is how the concept is applied contextually, but more broadly, I'll add that he doesn't say that limited only to this context, but he speaks this in general by simply saying that knowledge of Bhagavan is the cause of Shraddha or conviction in him. So what this also gives us an understanding about is the nature of the Shraddha he's talking about. We've discussed in our course on the Chaitanya Charitamrita and the Shraddha Prakaran in the Sanatana Shiksha, how Shraddha is defined in the commentary on the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu that we just cited there as Shastriya Shraddha, or Shastra Artha Vishwas, conviction in the meaning of Shastra, or in the object Shastra describes. So here we have this idea that knowledge of Bhagavan is the cause of Shraddha. So what is the object that Shastra describes? It's bhakti, it's the abhideya, or it's Bhagavan, it's the Advaya Gyan Tattva. So from that knowledge that the Shastra is describing will be born conviction in that, which implies that there's something self-evidently meaningful, self-evidently valuable in that object of knowledge. So to write this way is to trust in the self-evident aesthetic or conceptual or just general value of what is being described. So, which is fundamentally different than what you find in other religious traditions, where there's an idea that this ought to be obeyed just because we say so, or just because that's the commandment to do so, or what have you. But rather to say that your conviction in this, your quote-unquote belief in this, or your faith in this, sometimes belief and faith can mean different things for people, but without elaborating too much off the topic, generally we're referring to Shraddha, which in my opinion overlaps a bit of what those terms connote in English. Here he's saying that this isn't just something you do without a conceptual or a rational basis, but rather it's something that emerges from it, which is also a point that Jiva Gosvami hints at, or makes, you could say, a little bit softly at the end of the Shraddha Prakaran in the Bhakti Sandarbha, where he explains that faith is initially present, and then after deliberation, it becomes full, or it becomes mature. The implication being that as knowledge deepens, the firmness or the maturity of faith commensurately also becomes firm or deep. So what this has implications for, so to speak, is a check upon fanaticism, or a check upon the idea that we just believe things without there being a understanding for why we're believing them, or that we'll first make a belief and then we'll wrap our head around whatever theory we're supposed to believe, or what is the thing that we're told to think, but rather that you think, and when you think well, you'll end up with conviction in this. Rather than use your intelligence to follow the route or follow the pre-wrote, diagram or the predefined conclusion. Rather, use your own discernment, exercise that defining feature of your humanity, your capacity for vivek, as we've discussed in the past, and you'll arrive at conviction of this by the merits of what is said. So, this is, another statement of Jiva Gosvami that can affirm that approach, that this is the premise of being a follower of the Goswamis, of having, eligibility for the path that they've taught. So the idea that we can have shraddha, but we don't need to study Shastra, we don't need to learn what is bhakti, we don't need to learn what is Bhagavan, we don't need to learn what these, the seminal acharyas of our sampradaya have taught, and we can think that we have all due eligibility to achieve all success. This is, a bit reckless, a bit foolhardy. And here you have, Jiva Goswami himself saying that your conviction will be born of the knowledge that you have. And another side of this is that the faith that they want you to have is not just faith that's uneducated faith. They want you to have a precise, refined form of faith that emerges from an education, that emerges from knowledge, not that is just formed, out of a habitual tendency to cling on to some set of ideas, to create some sort of coherence in one's life, and then bend the rest of everything around that. So anyway, that's off the topic of where we are now, but I just feel that that's a very valuable point of Jiva Goswami, and isn't one that I emphasized when we talked about that in the Chaitanya Charitamrita class. So I just wanted to add that as a footnote. So anyway, back to the context here, he's saying that even people who lack that knowledge, who are doing worship but don't understand what they're doing, there's still value in that. It's not that there's no benefit. Gradually there will be benefit, but it's meant to go on this track, or as and when they get that knowledge and then their conviction becomes refined in its focus and its clarity, with that will come, correspondent, grace and correspondent, benefit and reciprocation, because here he's, saying that when someone does this act of worship in a state of ignorance, then it doesn't produce any swift result, it doesn't bring them any peace of mind, and it doesn't please Bhagavan. But nevertheless, Bhagavan is saying there is a non-futility of that. In other words, there is still some general benefit of that. So how does that work? That's what's explained here. So, back to the text. Being a performer of one's own duty, karma, one should worship me, Ishvara, in a deity or elsewhere, only so long as one does not know me to be present in all beings. So this is one of the statements that can seem like it's saying, deity worship, that's just for the people who don't recognize the all-pervading presence of Bhagavan. That's some elementary thing for the immature. This is the topic that's being hinted at or referred to in the Bhagavad-dharma-tattva. So it's important here how Jiva Goswami resolves this impression. So he says, in this regard, one's duty or karmas being an assistant to bhakti is mentioned in this verse because of the absence of eligibility for pure bhakti on the part of someone in whom shraddha is not manifested. So he's taking this in context, that the person doesn't have shraddha or knowledge of the presence of Bhagavan elsewhere, therefore this person couldn't be on the path of bhakti because they don't have the eligibility for that. So therefore this is a person who's on the path of karma, and therefore this verse enjoins performing karma. This will be taught later in the 11th canto, Jatta Shraddha Mat Kathasu. That is, later in Srimad Bhagavatam, Bhagavan Sri Krishna explains that one who has shraddha in bhakti to him becomes disinterested in all the duties of one's varna and ashram, and thus it can be understood that the verse under discussion, wherein performance of those duties is enjoined, is not directed towards those who already have shraddha in the path of bhakti, and rather is directed towards those who lack such shraddha. Thus it also follows, as a conclusion in this regard, that one in whom shraddha in bhakti has manifested, as a result of acquiring knowledge of Bhagavan. So note this, right? How does someone acquire shraddha? As a result of knowledge of Bhagavan. What should they do? thereafter, after acquiring Shraddha, not worship Bhagavan, quote, in a deity while being a performer of one's duty, as is advised in this verse 25, but rather, one should perform only pure worship and so forth. One should only engage in the practice of bhakti alone, rather than the practice of bhakti combined with karma, as was enjoined in the verse. This principle too will be taught in 1129, Tavad Karmani Kurvita. That is, later in Srimad Bhagavatam, Bhagavan Sri Krishna also explains that one should observe one's duties only until one acquires Shraddha in bhakti, and that after one acquires Shraddha in bhakti, it becomes a fault to remain engaged in the duties enjoined for those on the path of karma. That one should not, however, abandon the deity is the meaning, because of contradiction of the following statement in Hayashirsha Pancharatra. If one were to abandon the deity, were to abandon the deity one worshipped, while one was still following the path of karma, after one took up the path of bhakti. Quote, an installed deity is not to be abandoned. One should worship it as long as one lives. Better abandoning one's life, or even cutting off one's head. That is, it is better to give up one's life than abandon the worship of the deity. So, a strong remark here. So this is the critical point of interpretation, is when Kapila Dev is saying one should follow the path of karma and worship the deity until one realizes the presence of Bhagavan in all beings. So someone would interpret that to mean, okay, so once you realize that Bhagavan is in all beings, then you can give up the deity worship. But Jiva Goswami, no, that's not the meaning. The meaning is, until when you realize that Bhagavan is present in all beings, then after that, keep worshipping the deity, drop the karma. So it might be a slightly not the most likely interpretation that someone would come up with when they initially read the verse, but that's why he quotes these two statements in the 11th canto to support his interpretation, where it shows that those who have Shraddha and Bhakti are advised to engage in practices of Bhakti and also to give up the path of karma. So that in that way we can see how this concern raised by Gopakumar in the Bhagavad-dharma-tattva is resolved. That it would seem like this verse is saying, those people following the path of karma and doing deity worship, that's just until they realize the Paramatma. And once they realize the Paramatma, they don't need that anymore. But he's saying, no. Because the two actions are being described together. Being a performer of karma, worship the deity. So then do that until you realize the presence of Paramatma everywhere. So he's saying that doesn't mean once you realize the presence of Paramatma, drop both. Rather he's saying, or it doesn't mean drop the deity worship. Rather it means keep the deity worship thereafter and drop the karma side of it. So it's an interpretation, and he's giving context or reference from other prakaranas in the text to support that interpretation. Logically, it could go either way. So because of the logical, you could say, ambiguity or scope for potential interpretations, he's clarifying the way it should be understood here, and that clarification addresses the concern that's brought up in the Bhagavad-dharma-tattva. But again, just to come back to the point I was emphasizing earlier, he returns to this point about the relationship between Shraddha and Gyan by saying, Bhagavat Gyanat Urdvam Jata Shraddhas, that someone becomes a person in whom Shraddha has appeared after they acquire knowledge of Bhagavan, or as a result of having knowledge of Bhagavan. So what does that mean? It means if someone supposedly has Shraddha but doesn't have much knowledge, then that's not the Shraddha Jiva Goswami is talking about. The Shraddha that Jiva Goswami is talking about is the kind that comes from having knowledge. So this is also important to understand in order to be a follower of the path of Goswami, the path of bhakti as the Goswamis taught it. Okay, so Chakravarti Pad, he has a few things to add in this regard. So this is as follows. Quote, because of those possessed of pure bhaktis being of pure psyche, entirely of their own accord, their disrespecting any living being is generally not possible. So why do we disrespect other people? Well, because they do so many bad things. No, we disrespect other people because of the impurity in our own mind. Someone may behave one way, someone may behave another. That doesn't have any bearing on whether we treat others with respect. We treat people with respect regardless of how they behave. We don't sink to their level, and if we do, that's because of impurities in our own psyche. So he's saying because people who have purity of psyche or chitta shuddhi, of their own accord, don't engage in disrespect of others. So for those possessed of bhakti mixed with karma, however, this is certainly possible as long as impurity of the psyche remains. So as long as there are impurities in our psyche, then we're liable to behaving disrespectfully. When it becomes pure, however, this, meaning disrespecting others, shall not remain. So here's a tool for introspection. How much have I purified my own psyche? Well, how consistently am I able to treat others with respect? So considering this, then, duty too is not necessary to perform, since the purpose of performing it, namely purification of the psyche, has already been accomplished at that point. Thus he says, Archanado. So he follows Jiva Goswami's line of thought, but this point I thought was worth adding in terms of how Chitta Shuddhi has a bearing also on our respectfulness of others. And that ties into what we discussed also in the Shraddha Prakaran, which we can derive from the whole discussion of Adhikar and the Sindhu, that there are three constituent elements of the Adhikar. Shraddha, Shastra Yukti, or understanding of the reasoning given in the Shastra, and Chitta Shuddhi. So someone who has both that knowledge of what is taught in the Shastra, the Shraddha that emerges from that, the ability to understand the Shastra as it's meant to be, the capacity to interpret it accurately, and purification of the psyche, that person who's enriched with all of those things will be fully eligible for this path. In other words, when they go to put this path into action, they will swiftly experience the result. So, as per this analysis, the intended sense of verse 25, which can also be considered apt advice for, quote, one who in regard to a deity has the thought of stone, is as follows. Quote, being a performer of one's karma, one should worship me in a deity or elsewhere, so long as one does not know in one's own heart, me, Ishvara, to be present in all beings. And once one does, then one should continue to worship a deity of myself, but purely as my bhakta, rather than as a follower of the path of karma. So applying the tikas, this is the whole instruction. In this way, Sri Jiva Pad and Sri Chakravarti Pad have clarified the intended sense of these statements in Srimad Bhagavatam that prima facie seem to speak of deity worship as something only for the lesser qualified. In his commentary on Brihad Bhagavatamrita, Sri Sanatana Pad further refers to a statement that, quote, an image is for those of meager intellect. So, Sanatana Goswami quoted 11.247, we talked about that in the previous class. He cited from these passages of Kapila-dev. We discussed those now. And as a fourth example of a statement in Shastra that seems to speak of deity worship as being for the lesser persons, he quotes this statement, which I didn't find any specific source for, but must be somewhere in the, textual sphere from which he drew, which simply says, Pratima manda buddhinam, that an image or a deity is for those of meager intellect. which would imply that it's not for those of refined intellect. So, in that regard, to one, he refers to that, and to one further verse from Srimad Bhagavatam, in regard to the query raised by Gopakumar as to why there are statements in the Puranas that seem to indicate inferiority on the part of a deity worshipper. So the last verse that he gives as an example that might be thought to speak lowly of the practice is this from the Prahlad Charit in the Bhagavatam, where it is said, "He, the master of the self of all jivas, who is complete by virtue of perception of himself, that is, by virtue of his own experience of the intense bliss inherent in his own essential nature, although compassionate, does not accept honor, meaning worship, from an ignorant person." So Bhagavan is compassionate, but doesn't accept the worship of the ignorant. So what does he mean by this? Sanatana Pad, a little later in that prakaran, he quotes this again and explains, quote, he explains that the import of this verse can be construed in this context as follows. Quote, ignorant means foolish, and foolishness is to be inferred in this case to be, quote, because of performing worship of an image of Sri Bhagavan with the idea of its being stolen or otherwise. Because of false conceit in regard to oneself, and because of the aforementioned manner of disregard for Vaishnavas, disrespect towards all beings, and so on. Therefore, he does not accept someone's worship, is the purport. So, if here it says, Bhagavan, although he's compassionate, doesn't accept the worship of the ignorant. Who is that ignorant person? It's the person who thinks the image is just a piece of stone, who has a false understanding of their own selves, or is arrogant based on a false understanding of self, and who doesn't show due regard to Vaishnavas or to other living beings. So, as we've discussed in the earlier verses, even when someone lacks all those things, and here it's being said Bhagavan doesn't accept their worship, nevertheless, they can still continue, and there's still the scope for them to gradually be benefited by doing that. But the idea is that Bhagavan will, quote, accept it once the flaws therein are rectified. So just because he doesn't accept it doesn't mean it ought not be done, as per the analysis in the previous class. So now, having discussed all these points that are brought up in the commentary, we'll come back to the narrative here in the Bhagavatamrita. So after Gopakumar raises his aforecited inquiry regarding all such statements in the Puranas that seem to indicate inferiority on the part of deity worshippers, Sri Narada replies as follows. So essentially, Gopakumar refers to all these statements and says, it seems like deity worship is for ignorant people, because Bhagavan doesn't accept it when it's done by people who are ignorant, and it's only for the people of lower intellect, and so on and so forth, as per the apparent implied sense of these statements. So how does Narada address this? He says, let alone the greatness of worship of those images of Bhagavan, which have been designated by me to be equal to Bhagavan in person, by virtue of their being constituted of eternal being, consciousness, and bliss, just as Bhagavan is. There shall be no fault as a result of disregard of swadharma, and so forth, in the form of degradation or otherwise, that is, in the form of one's being liable for a deviation from proper conduct because of relinquishing one's swadharma, or because of ignorance regarding the proper manner of worship, for worshippers of ancient, modern, or even fabricated images, with the understanding of them being Bhagavan in person. Rather, verily a great quality is recognized, that such worship, which is itself considered the supreme ultimate attainment, because of its superiority to even the Chaturvarga, is recognized to be superlative bhakti. So this is a strong statement. So Narada is essentially saying deity worship is no thing merely for the ignorant. When it's done with this crucial understanding that this is worship of Bhagavan, that Bhagavan is manifest as this deity, then it's so valuable that even if one neglects all of the duties one has on the path of karma to engage in it, there's no fault at all. And even if one lacks, knowledge of how exactly to do the rituals or expertise in reciting mantras and all these things, it doesn't matter. And whether the deity is an ancient, famous deity or a recently manifested deity or even just a, quote, fabricated one, in other words, even just one that was made, it's not about whether the deity has some great lore around it or was worshipped by some Mahatma in the past, or that's all fine and good. But what really matters is the consciousness, is the idea of the person. So he's saying whatever the deity is, however it has become manifest, when it's worshipped with this vision, with this attitude, that it's equal to Bhagavan in person, or that it's essentially a manifest form of Bhagavan and worshipped as such, then that is even greater than moksha. It's greater than the Chaturvarga. In other words, when you have faith and you see it that way, it is that. When you have faith that I'm here in front of Bhagavan himself and I'm worshipping Bhagavan himself, then you're in front of Bhagavan and you're worshipping him himself. And that's something superior even to Sayuja Mukti or these other things. So when it has that understanding, when it's done with conviction on the basis of that understanding, it's a supremely wonderful thing. This is how Narada begins his reply. So Sri Narada's point here is that provided a worshipper does not consider a deity to be merely a piece of stone, and rather sees the deity to be a visibly manifest form of Bhagavan himself, that is constituted of eternal being, consciousness, and bliss, just as Bhagavan is, there is no fault whatsoever in deity worship, and rather there is profound greatness. So this is also just touching very briefly on a point we made in an earlier class, the idea that in certain religious traditions there's a prohibition against deity worship, and then when that type of prohibition is interpreted, there can be a common interpretation that anybody who worships an image is doing that, and that's what's forbidden. But you can see here in this analysis, there's a specific distinction and a strong distinction made between the attitude with which one goes about the worship. In other words, there's what physical act of ritual one is performing, and then there's the understanding and the conviction with which one is performing it. And so Narada or Sanatana Gosvami is saying that this makes a world of difference. What is the viewpoint, what is the conviction of the person performing the act? So it's faultless or faulty. It's either not of any immediate great benefit or it's of profoundly great benefit as per the attitude that one has. Such worship is considered superior even to moksha, meaning it is considered direct service to Sri Bhagavan, which is itself the ultimate purushartha. Sri Narada then uses a fortiori reasoning to explain this viewpoint even more pointedly. Quote, attainment or siddhi, i.e. moksha or the acquisition of any and all desired objects, can occur even as a result of honoring with an obeisance, a sprinkling of water, and so on, a blade of grass with vision of Bhagavan being present within it as the inner regulator, and as a result of only pronouncing or hearing a semblance or a bhas of the name of Bhagavan. Therefore, how could there be even any conjecture of a fault, or otherwise, when a deity of him, that is a dwelling place of his, that is consecrated by mantras, is a reminder of him, in other words, it looks like him and evokes remembrance of him, and is an object of offerings of all limbs of bhakti, is being worshipped. So he's saying, if namabhas, if just a name spoken not even about Bhagavan that happens to be his name can cause liberation, if worshipping or showing respect to a blade of grass is enough to liberate you when it's done with the understanding that Bhagavan is present within it, then if someone offers worship to a deity of Bhagavan and moreover does so using mantras, does so using names of Bhagavan, does so in a way that they're cognizing or they're experiencing awareness or cognition of Bhagavan, being reminded of Bhagavan by the appearance of the deity, and as they're doing that worship, they're engaging in kirtan and smaran and vandana and all these other forms of bhakti, then, what problem could there possibly be with that? That's the bringing together of all of these things in an extraordinary way. You're bringing together Shravan, Kirtan, Smaran, Padasevan, Archan, Vandana, as per the bhav of the person. There may be Dasya there may be Sakya there may be Atmanivedan there. So, how could this not be highly beneficial for people? So this is his Kaimutya Nyaya argument, that if you can get benefit by just honoring a blade of grass with the right attitude, if you can get benefit by namabhas, then doing all of these things that are so tangibly, directly forms of adoration of Bhagavan, there must be, if there's any benefit in bhakti, then this must be beneficial. So, let me not elaborate too much, and let rather Sanatana Gosvami elucidate the significance of the latter part of Narada's rejoinder in his commentary. So he says, how could there be any conjecture of a fault or otherwise when a dwelling place that is an image of Sri Bhagavan, is being worshipped? How could you even think there's any problem with this? In other words, prohibitions against this, ideas that it's inferior, how could you think that there's any flaw in this? How could there be any faults or otherwise to be deliberated upon in this regard, is the meaning. Indeed, rather, upon deliberation, these certainly do not arise. That is, there is no fault, drawback, deficiency, or anything of the sort. The causes in this regard, that is, the three reasons why there is no fault or otherwise in this regard, are as follows. Quote number 1, the image is consecrated by mantras, that is, those of invocation and so forth. Thereby, production in the mind of a worshipper of the vision of the of the figure of Sri Bhagavan there in the image, by way of the withdrawal of the thought of the image being made of stone, wood, and so on, is shown. That is, because an image is consecrated with mantras that evoke his presence, honor his presence, and so on, the idea that the image is merely a piece of stone, wood, or otherwise automatically leaves the mind of a worshipper of the image who cognizes the meaning conveyed by the mantras used in the process of worship, since the mantras indicate that the image is a manifest form of Bhagavan himself. The worshipper thus sees the image as such. So if one participates in a ceremony, if one understands that Bhagavan's presence is evoked here, is adored here, then people are not thinking this is an image. People are thinking this is Bhagavan. So when you say someone's performing deity worship, why would you assume that they're not thinking that this is Bhagavan himself? Why would you assume that they're thinking this is a stone, when all such worship begins with prayers and invocations that negate that idea? Moreover, it is also indicated that no sort of fallacious logic or kutarka is possible in this regard because of the inconceivable powerfulness of jewels, mantras, and special herbs. So this is a common argument. As jewels, mantras, and special herbs are observed to produce effects that one cannot fully comprehend or explain, so a mantra can be understood to evoke the presence of Bhagavan in an image in a way that is beyond human capacity to comprehend or explain. And thus one should not try to negate the presence of Bhagavan in and as an image that is consecrated with mantras. In other words, people regularly accept that jewels or mantras or herbs can do things that we can't explain how they work, but they work. So if a mantra is being used to evoke the presence of Bhagavan, then why should we claim that that's not possible? Things that are beyond our comprehension or beyond our ability to fully explain are possible. We observe them happening. Therefore, we cannot know or affirm that this is not that. So we shouldn't raise such a fallacious argument, is his point. Furthermore, too, an image is a reminder of him, namely Bhagavan, that is a cause of remembrance him by way of bearing resemblance to his appearance or figure and so forth. Or an image is a cause of meditator's meditation upon Bhagavan because of the accomplishment of contemplation of him easily as a result of direct sight, simultaneously of the beautiful limbs, sublimbs, and so forth of the image, which are regarded as being the beautiful limbs, sublimbs, and so forth of Bhagavan himself, and thus inspire meditation upon Bhagavan's limbs, sublimbs, and so forth within the mind. So when someone already has knowledge of the appearance of Bhagavan, and they see the deity, what do they think? What are they reminded of? Bhagavan! So how could they not be engaging in this worship with awareness of Bhagavan? Or how could this act of worshipping the deity not involve cognition of Bhagavan and an offering of adoration to Bhagavan? It naturally does, because of the image's likeness and thus being a cause of remembrance of Bhagavan. This is the second point. Furthermore, 3, the image is an object of offerings, even all, that is, even of the 9 types of bhakti, because of accomplishment of hearing, praising, remembering, serving, offering obeisance, and so on, automatically in the course of worship, of offering worship to the image. So as per the rituals, you'll end up offering obeisance, you'll end up hearing names of Bhagavan, you'll end up speaking names of Bhagavan, you'll end up remembering Bhagavan, etc. So if you engage in the ritual worship, you'll inevitably perform so many acts of bhakti. So how could this not be beneficial to people? If you recognize the benefit of these acts of bhakti, then you can definitely recognize this complex ritual, if you will, that compounds and integrates many together. After Sri Narada in this way explains, I'll just read a little more, but I think I'm up to here. After Sri Narada in this way explains the great benefit of deity worship and negates there being any fault in it when it is performed with the understanding that the deity is a visibly manifest form of Sri Bhagavan himself, then Gopakumar raises the subject of offense to Vaishnavas and indicates that if someone absorbs themselves in deity worship, this will result in their committing offense to Vaishnavas as a result of neglecting Vaishnavas out of preference for engaging in such worship. So this is another consideration. If someone accepts all these other points, this is naturally causing people to perform these acts of bhakti, so if we can accept that much is beneficial, then you might say, okay, on the other extreme, this is causing people to engage in all these acts of bhakti, so they're going to end up neglecting to honor Vaishnavas because they're so busy doing this grand practice of deity worship, therefore this is going to be detrimental. So sort of jumping to the other extreme and raising another objection. So that is addressed as follows. He says, disregard for those devoted to Krishna should never be possible for those engaged in worship of a deity of Krishna. So he's saying, not likely. If ever it occurs, because of a worshipper's being intently engaged therein, in other words, if someone's just at some particular moment really absorbed, such that they don't even are aware of the presence of a Vaishnava, they, that is, those devoted to Krishna, namely the Vaishnavas, do not take offense and rather praise such a worshipper. In other words, if some Vaishnava comes along and sees that someone is, steeped in their worship and not even aware of what's going on around them, they're not like, hey, why aren't you paying attention to me? They're going like, Jai, look at this Vaishnava blissfully engaged in Bhagavan Seva. They're charmed by that. This is how Sanatana Gosvami is viewing the matter. So Sri Narada's point here is that because bhaktas are pleased to see someone deeply absorbed in ritual worship of Sri Bhagavan, they will not take offense at any disregard that arises as a result of this. It should be understood, however, that here Sri Narada does not refer to a case in which a bhakta intentionally disregards a Vaishnava, because they think their own ritual worship of Bhagavan in his deity form is more important or pleasing to Bhagavan than their honoring of Sri Bhagavan in the heart of his bhaktas. As the case of Maharaj Indradyumna in Srimad Bhagavatam shows, a bhakta may take offense at this, and whether or not a bhakta does or not, Sri Bhagavan is not pleased by such behavior, because he himself, for the purpose of preempting the presence of such a mentality in the mind of bhaktas, mentions to Uddhava in the midst of an enumeration of acts of bhakti that, quote, exceeding worship of my bhakta, the import, sorry, I didn't read the right cadence, but in other words, Bhagavan mentions to preclude that tendency, something what he calls mad bhakta puja bhyadika, or exceeding worship of my bhakta. The import being that Sri Bhagavan is pleased by worship of his bhaktas that exceeds, that is, takes precedence even over worship of himself when and where warranted. So it's not that mad bhakta puja bhyadika means worship bhaktas and never engage in deity seva ever, but it means that if you're engaging in deity seva, but then there's the necessity of attending to a Vaishnava, attend to the Vaishnava. You can even leave the ritual worship of Bhagavan incomplete to go and honor the bhakta. That is a due instance of it taking precedence, or being shown greater regard, or exceeding in its reception of attention from you. So, on the whole, the point is refuted that if someone engages in deity worship, they'll end up disrespecting Vaishnavas. So no, the person will understand that the Vaishnava should be attended to whenever required, and that can even take precedence over their performance of their archan to the deity. But that is unlikely to happen, and if it happens unintentionally, a bhakta is not going to be upset. In the case of Agastya, who could see that Indradyumna was doing it with perhaps a bit of pride or perhaps a misunderstanding, then he gave this curse to correct him. So it shouldn't be feigned, but if it's genuine, there's no harm in that, and a bhakta won't take it personally. So one might, in this regard, say, well, what about the whole premise of the Bhagavatam? Maharaj Parikshit cursed the rishi who didn't attend to him because the rishi was absorbed in meditation. Maharaj Parikshit got angry. And here Sanatana Gosvami is saying they don't take offense and they rather praise people. But Parikshit Maharaj didn't do that. So I'm raising this as an objection, you could say, to Sanatana Goswami's siddhanta here. And this doesn't come up in the commentary there. This is just as a reference from, general understanding. So my attempt to resolve that would be that in the tikas on the Bhagavatam, for example, in Chakravartipad's Tika, in that section about Maharaj Parikshit's anger, he says that actually this happened by the will of Bhagavan, that this is out of character for Parikshit Maharaj, and it wasn't really that he acted like that, but this circumstance was engineered to bring about this greater set of conditions for the Bhagavatam to be spoken, and so on and so forth. So that's one way of reconciling that particular case with this general custom that we see mentioned here by Sanatana Gosvami in the teachings of Narada. So I think I'll stop here for today. So just to recap, he's addressing these statements that deity worship is for the less intelligent, or it's to be given up once you realize that Bhagavan is everywhere, or these apparent statements that seem to speak little of it. Bhagavan doesn't accept worship from the ignorant. So all of these things are reconciled to show that rather worship is supremely beneficial, but it's supremely beneficial when it's done with a clear understanding of the deity being being seen as a manifest form of Bhagavan. And that when it's done lacking that understanding, it can still gradually benefit people, but it won't have the same excellence or immediate benefit in doing so. And then the final point is raised, and then in addition to that, because the act of ritual worship integrates all these other acts of bhakti, it's so wonderful because it brings people and engages people in so many of these different practices of bhakti, so certainly is highly beneficial for people. And if it's so beneficial and so wonderful that people get so absorbed in it that they end up neglecting Vaishnavas, then don't worry, the Vaishnavas will be happy to see that. They won't take offense. But nevertheless, if one is doing deity worship, but one attention comes to the fact that there's a Vaishnava who requires attention, then attend to the Vaishnava. Don't give precedence even to the deity worship over and above to the neglect of the Vaishnava. This point of balance is there. So I'll conclude here for today, and in our coming reading we'll probably come to the rest of this passage in the Bhagavatamrita that deals with some of these different finer points regarding statements about deity worship in the Bhagavatam and elsewhere. And all of this will inform us as to what is the great value of seeing the deity to be a manifest form of Bhagavan. And as Jiva Gosvami said in the passage we cited earlier, there are multiple ways to see the deity as a manifest form of Bhagavan, but rather than seeing it as, the Paramatma is everywhere, the Paramatma is also here, but to rather see that Bhagavan has manifested as this deity out of his grace to accept the seva of his bhaktas, and is Bhagavan simply because he looks like Bhagavan and reminds one of Bhagavan and can be seen as Bhagavan, and one can therefore worship him as such. This third understanding from the passage of the Bhakti Sandarbha we discussed previously, this echoes through all this discussion as the what Jiva Goswami called the vision of the greatest of worshippers. So I'll conclude here. If anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, or otherwise, please feel free to share. All right, well, I hope that was all clear for today. So I'll conclude here. And if we're so blessed, then in our next reading, we'll dive further into this subject matter about how we can adore the deity and experience Bhagavan's presence right before our eyes by virtue of our knowledge acquired from Shastra and our faith. Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namo. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.
Thank you, Baba.